The most powerful woman in Europe is losing her grip, and the people pulling the rug are not her enemies. They are her allies. Behind the marble walls of Brussels, in the closed door sessions that never make the headlines, the whispers have turned into war cries. Leaders who once smiled for the cameras beside Ursula von der Leyen are now sharpening their knives in private. The revolt has begun, and this time it will not be stopped. For years, Ursula von der Leyen operated like an untouchable empress at the heart of the European Union. She commanded budgets that dwarfed the GDP of entire nations. She dictated energy policy, migration frameworks, digital regulations, and foreign strategy to 500 million people without a single one of them casting a vote in her name. She was the unelected Queen of Brussels, and the throne seemed permanent. But permanence in politics is always an illusion. And right now, that illusion is shattering at a speed that is leaving veteran EU diplomats white-knuckled and speechless. The cracks did not appear overnight. They were building for months, hidden beneath the polished surface of summits and press conferences where everyone clapped and no one said what they actually thought. But something has shifted. The mask of unity that the European Union spent decades constructing with painstaking diplomatic theater is now falling apart in real time. And the leaders doing the unmasking are not fringe outsiders or populist rebels shouting from the periphery. They are the heavyweights, the power brokers, the very people whose support kept von der Leyen's machine running. And they are done. Let's start with the most seismic signal. Giorgia Meloni, the Italian prime minister who turned Rome into the most watched capital in Europe, has been sending unmistakable messages to Brussels. Meloni did not come to power to be managed by a German bureaucrat with a Brussels address. She came to power with a mandate from the Italian people. A mandate built on two words that von der Leyen has always treated like threats: sovereignty and borders. For months, Meloni tolerated the Brussels framework, navigating carefully, playing the long game, but the patience has run out. Behind closed doors, Meloni's government has been openly questioning why Italy should continue bearing the heaviest burden of Mediterranean migration, while von der Leyen issues flowery statements and delivers zero solutions. The Italian coast is not a photo opportunity. It is a crisis, and Brussels has been managing it with press releases while Rome manages it with Coast Guard vessels. Meloni's frustration is not just about migration, it runs deeper. It is about who actually holds power in Europe. Every time Rome tries to chart its own course on energy, on trade, on fiscal policy, it runs into the invisible wall of Brussels orthodoxy, a wall built and maintained by von der Leyen's commission. Meloni has had enough of that wall, and she is not alone. Viktor Orban has been the loudest voice against von der Leyen for years. But what is new and what is explosive is the nature of his current campaign. Orban is no longer just blocking and vetoing from Budapest. He is building. He is constructing an alternative architecture of European power, a coalition of governments that reject the Brussels establishment model entirely. His Patriots for Europe alliance is not a protest movement. It is a power structure. And as it grows, von der Leyen's authority over the continent's political direction shrinks in direct proportion. Every new government that joins Orban's bloc is another government that has publicly declared it does not recognize von der Leyen's vision as its own. That is not opposition, that is delegitimization. But here's where the story becomes truly dangerous for von der Leyen. The rebellion is no longer confined to the right flank. Emmanuel Macron, the man who positioned himself as the great defender of European unity, the self-styled visionary of a sovereign and powerful Europe, is now one of the most frustrated leaders on the continent. And his frustration is aimed directly at Brussels. Macron's demands for major structural reforms within the EU are not diplomatic talking points. They are warnings. Macron has watched his domestic political capital evaporate, partly because of economic pressures that Brussels' policies have either caused or dramatically worsened. French industry is under siege. French voters are enraged, and Macron is not in a position to keep absorbing punishment on behalf of a Brussels Commission that shows zero willingness to adapt, evolve, or acknowledge its own catastrophic failures. When Macron talks about reform, what he is really saying is this: the current model is broken, the current leadership is incapable of fixing it. And France will not keep paying the political price for someone else's ideological stubbornness. That is not an endorsement of von der Leyen. That is a verdict. And then there is Olaf Scholz, the German chancellor who was supposed to be von der Leyen's natural anchor, the stable center-left pillar of the Brussels consensus, is now signaling a frustration so deep it has begun to surface in public statements. Germany's economy is not in a rough patch. It is in structural freefall. The industrial backbone of Europe is cracking under the weight of energy costs, regulatory burdens, and a Brussels-approved green transition that was designed in an ideological bubble completely disconnected from economic reality. Scholz knows the numbers. His economists have shown him the trajectory. And that trajectory leads to a place no German chancellor can survive politically. So when Scholz signals frustration with Brussels, read it for exactly what it is: a man calculating whether loyalty to von der Leyen is now a threat to his own political survival. Four of the most powerful leaders in Europe, all frustrated, all questioning, all privately asking the same question that nobody has yet dared to ask out loud in front of the cameras. Is it time for Brussels to have a different face at the top? The answer to that question is moving closer to yes with every passing week. But replacing Ursula von der Leyen is not as simple as calling a vote. The machinery that keeps her in place is vast, deeply embedded, and ruthlessly protective of itself. And the most terrifying part of this entire story is not that the revolt is happening. It is what the revolt reveals about the true state of the European Union. Because if leaders of this stature with this much power are this desperate for change, what does that tell you about how close to the edge Brussels actually is? The corridors of Brussels power have always operated on a simple, brutal principle: loyalty is currency and betrayal is a death sentence. For years, von der Leyen understood this better than anyone. She built her commission like a fortress, placing allies in key positions, rewarding compliance, and freezing out dissent with the quiet efficiency of someone who had studied European bureaucratic warfare her entire career. But a fortress is only as strong as the loyalty of the people inside it. And right now, the people inside are unlocking the gates. The internal revolt inside the European Commission is not happening in press conferences or parliamentary debates. It is happening in the language of bureaucracy, in delayed approvals, in leaked documents, in position papers that contradict the official line, in senior officials who suddenly become unavailable for comment. This is how Brussels bleeds, not in dramatic public confrontations, but in the slow, suffocating withdrawal of cooperation from people who have decided the current leadership no longer deserves their cover. And that withdrawal is accelerating. Sources close to multiple EU delegations have confirmed what the official statements carefully conceal. The level of genuine confidence in von der Leyen's strategic direction has collapsed among senior commission staff. The woman who once commanded rooms with absolute authority now walks into sessions where the questions are sharper, the silence is longer, and the deference noticeably absent. The body language of power has changed in Brussels, and in a system built almost entirely on the performance of authority, that change is catastrophic. The migration crisis is the wound that will not close. Von der Leyen promised a new migration pact that would finally bring order to the chaos tearing at Europe's borders and social fabric. What Europe got instead was a framework so riddled with compromises, loopholes, and implementation gaps that it satisfied nobody and solved nothing. Italy is still overwhelmed. Greece is still overwhelmed. The Aegean and the Mediterranean are still crossing points for hundreds of thousands of people that European governments have no coherent plan to process, integrate, or return. And every week that this crisis continues without resolution is another week that leaders like Meloni and Orban can point to Brussels and say, "We told you. We told you the von der Leyen model was fantasy dressed up as policy." Meloni's position is particularly lethal to von der Leyen's standing because Meloni has delivered something von der Leyen never could: actual results within her own jurisdiction. Italy, under Meloni, has driven boat arrivals down through bilateral deals with North African governments, deals negotiated without Brussels' permission and frequently in direct contradiction of Brussels' preferences. Meloni did not ask for a commission framework. She picked up the phone, flew to Tunis, and got it done. That contrast, a national government achieving real outcomes while Brussels produces documents, is not just embarrassing for von der Leyen. It is a direct challenge to the foundational argument for her commission's existence. And Orban is weaponizing that contrast with masterful precision. His messaging across the Patriots for Europe network is disciplined and devastating. The argument is simple. Look at what Brussels management has produced: record energy prices, deindustrialization, migration chaos, digital censorship, cultural fracturing. Now look at the countries that resisted the Brussels model: lower energy costs, protected borders, preserved sovereignty, stronger national identity. The argument lands because the data supports it, and von der Leyen has no effective counter-argument because she cannot point to a single major policy area where her commission's approach has produced an unambiguous success that ordinary Europeans can feel in their daily lives. The economic dimension of this revolt is where the real earthquake is building. Macron's demand for structural reform is inseparable from the economic catastrophe that Brussels' green ideology has accelerated across the continent. French manufacturers are relocating. German chemical giants are shutting European facilities and moving production to the United States and Asia. The Volkswagen crisis was not an isolated corporate story. It was a symptom of a continental industrial policy so divorced from competitive reality that it is now producing a managed decline that European leaders are running out of ways to disguise. Von der Leyen's response to this industrial collapse has been to double down on the green transition framework, to insist that the pain is temporary and the transformation is necessary, to present the destruction of European industrial capacity as a courageous step toward a cleaner future. But the leaders who have to face voters are no longer willing to sell that story. Macron cannot walk into a factory town in northern France and tell workers their jobs were sacrificed for a Brussels climate target. Scholz cannot stand in front of a shuttered Bavarian auto supplier and explain that the Commission's vision required this outcome. The political cost of defending von der Leyen's ideological framework has become too high for leaders who still have elections to win and populations to answer to. This is the fracture line that is widening fastest. The European Commission under von der Leyen operates in a consequence-free zone. She does not face voters, she does not lose elections, she does not stand in unemployment lines or explain factory closures to devastated communities. She manages Europe from a position of total insulation from the human cost of her decisions. And the leaders who do face those consequences are now openly furious about being forced to defend a policy architecture they had no real input in designing and no real power to change. Scholz's position deserves particular attention because it represents something historically significant. Germany has always been the bedrock of Brussels' authority. The German Chancellor's support has been the gravitational anchor that kept the European project stable through every crisis since its inception. When Germany is frustrated with Brussels' leadership, the entire institutional architecture of the EU trembles. Scholz is not just a frustrated politician making noise. He is the signal that the German establishment, the very foundation that von der Leyen's power rests on, is reassessing its position. And a Brussels Commission that has lost the genuine confidence of the German government is a commission that is already structurally in its final chapter. The talk of replacing von der Leyen is no longer confined to opposition benches or Eurosceptic media outlets. It is happening in the conversations that precede official meetings, in the dinners where microphones are switched off and the real assessments are made. Names are being floated, scenarios are being mapped. The question of succession is being treated not as a distant hypothetical, but as a near-term operational reality that multiple governments are quietly preparing for. But here is the razor edge that makes this moment so extraordinarily dangerous for the entire European project. The revolt against von der Leyen is not a revolt with a unified vision. Meloni wants sovereignty and closed borders. Macron wants a more powerful, more centralized Europe, just one led differently. Orban wants to dismantle the Brussels model entirely. Scholz wants economic relief without ideological rupture. These leaders agree that von der Leyen must go. They agree on almost nothing else. And a power vacuum at the top of the European Commission, filled by a coalition that cannot agree on the fundamental direction of the continent, is not a solution. It is the beginning of something far more unstable, far more unpredictable, and far more dangerous than anything von der Leyen ever produced. So ask yourself this. If the most powerful leaders in Europe are united only in their desire to tear down what exists, but divided on everything that should replace it, what happens to the 500 million people caught in the middle when Brussels finally breaks? The endgame has arrived, and it is uglier than anyone in Brussels is prepared to admit publicly. What is unfolding right now is not a political disagreement between leaders with different priorities. It is a fundamental reckoning with the question that the European Union has been avoiding since the day it was built. Can a continent of sovereign nations with separate histories, separate economies, separate cultures, and separate democratic mandates actually be governed by an unelected commission that answers to nobody and apologizes to no one? The answer delivered by the leaders of Europe's most powerful nations is arriving in real time, and it sounds like a verdict of no. Von der Leyen's survival strategy is now operating on borrowed time and diminishing returns. Her team understands the pressure. They have watched the coalition around her erode with the kind of slow inevitability that precedes every major political collapse in history. The response from her inner circle has been a combination of bureaucratic entrenchment and public relations desperation. More speeches about European unity, more summits with choreographed handshakes, more commission reports, projecting confidence that nobody inside the building actually feels. It is the behavior of a leadership that has lost the argument but refuses to surrender the podium. But the podium is being pulled from under her feet by forces she cannot negotiate with because these forces are not driven by ambition alone. They are driven by desperation. Macron is fighting for his political survival in a France that is boiling with anti-establishment fury. Melanie is managing a coalition that will punish any sign of weakness toward Brussels. Scholz is navigating an economic collapse that threatens to make Germany synonymous with managed decline for a generation. And Orban is leading a movement that has placed the destruction of the Brussels consensus at the very center of its identity. None of these leaders can afford to back down. None of them can afford to be seen defending a status quo that their own voters are rejecting in election after election across the continent. The European Parliament is no longer the rubber stamp it once was. The seismic shift in its political composition following the 2024 elections fundamentally altered the balance of power in ways that von der Leyen's Commission has never fully adapted to. The hard right surge that swept through France, Germany, Italy, Hungary, Austria, and the Netherlands was not a protest vote. It was a structural realignment of European political gravity. The voters of Europe sent a message in language so clear it required no translation. The current direction is unacceptable, and the current leadership is responsible. Von der Leyen read that result, absorbed it, and then proceeded to govern as if it had not happened. That decision, more than any single policy failure, is what has made her position untenable. The AfD's growing influence in Germany is directly connected to this story in ways that Brussels desperately wants to keep separate but cannot. Washington's open engagement with Alice Weidel and AfD leadership, while simultaneously cold-shouldering Merz and the CDU establishment, sent a message that reverberated through every European capital. America under Trump is not interested in managing the old European order. It is interested in identifying which European leaders align with the new global direction and investing in them accordingly. Von der Leyen represents everything the Trump administration has defined as the enemy: unelected technocratic control, green ideological overreach, digital censorship infrastructure, and reflexive anti-American multilateralism. She is not just politically inconvenient for Washington, she is a target. The American pressure being applied to European political structures is unprecedented in the post-Cold War era. Trump's strategists are not whispering in back channels anymore. They are openly signaling which European governments they consider partners and which they consider obstacles. Von der Leyen's commission falls firmly in the obstacle category. And as American economic leverage through tariffs, energy trade, and military commitment signals gets deployed with increasing directness against Brussels' priorities. The European leaders who have tied themselves to her vision are finding that loyalty increasingly expensive. The succession question is now the only question that matters in the rooms where European power is actually decided. And the brutal truth is that there is no candidate who can unify the fractured coalition that would need to come together to replace von der Leyen with something stable. Every name being discussed carries the political baggage of one faction and the automatic rejection of another. A Macron-backed candidate is dead on arrival with Meloni and Orban. An Orban-aligned candidate cannot command a parliamentary majority. A compromised technocrat from the center satisfies nobody in a political environment where the center is,